30 seconds and counting. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 25 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower cleared. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Brisbane, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Yeah, I'm going to step off the land now. That's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind.
On the 20th of July 1969, humans first set foot upon the moon. Wherever we go as a species in the future, the Apollo 11 moonwalk by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin will signify the start of our journey to other worlds. The challenge for the American people to span the distance from their own planet to Earth's nearest neighbour was made on the 25th of May 1961. On that date, President Kennedy declared before a joint session of Congress,
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Notwithstanding the audacious nature of such a goal, President Kennedy added that it was to be achieved at a cost of tens of billions of taxpayers' dollars. This was an astonishing political address for an American president to make, but there is a case to be made that the events leading up to President Kennedy's address before Congress were of such a unique nature, the perfect storm so to speak, and that the events that followed it, in particular the president's murder, meant that the middle of May 1961 is perhaps the only time in the whole of human history that such a national challenge could be both set and subsequently maintain the public and political support required to see it through to a successful conclusion. America, at that time, was facing adversaries who were aggressively pushing their opposing ideology of communism around the globe. Communism was seen as a dire threat to the United States, but with nuclear weapons deterring an outright war, it meant that the protagonists were having to operate in two very different environments. One existed in the shadows where spies operated in the secretive world of obtaining information, and the other was held in the full glare of the world where propaganda was used to influence and persuade. At the start of the 1940s, the ingredients for this clash did not exist, but during the Second World War and then through the 1950s, they would be placed one by one into the simmering pot that would become known as the Cold War. A conflict that would bring the world to the brink of nuclear destruction. All of that was a long way away in 1941, when conditions in both America and Russia were very different. Neither side had nuclear weapons, rockets were for science fiction tales, and both countries were doing their best to stay out of the war spreading across Europe. In the United States, the prevailing opinion in regards to the conflict taking place in Europe was one of isolationism. One influential promoter of this stance was Charles Lindbergh, who publicly called for America to leave Britain and her allies to fight on alone against the Nazis. He said, "The leaders of both the British and the Jewish races, for reasons which are not American, wish to involve us in the war." Lindbergh admired Hitler's Germany, having been impressed by the efficiency he had seen when he had visited the country in the 1930s. This admiration, coupled with his view that the Luftwaffe could defeat any air force sent against it, and his belief that too many Jews in a country resulted in chaos, resulted in Lindbergh declaring that the white races, as he described them, would suffer if America joined the war against Germany. According to Lindbergh, only by staying out of the war and preventing, as he put it, alien blood from entering the United States could they preserve the American way of life. While such outspoken anti-war sentiments raged in America, the Soviets had their own reasons for not wanting war with the Nazis. Weakened by Stalin's purges, their military was in no shape to face such a brutal and efficient killing machine. One victim of Stalin's purges was Sergei Korolev, who was sent to a Siberian gulag, an action that would come back to inflict a mortal wound on the Soviet space program at the height of the moon race. Instead of standing up to Hitler, the Soviets in fact decided to benefit from his aggressive land grab in Eastern Europe. Signing a non-aggression pact with the Nazis, the Soviets marched into Poland to claim their quota of the country as laid out in the agreement with Hitler. Whilst Great Britain and her allies faced the madness of Hitler and the Nazi regime, America and Russia were trying to remain out of the war. But in 1941 the war would come to them and catch both countries off guard. The Soviets were still sending materials west into Germany as the Nazis started invading east across the Russian border on the 26th of June, and the Americans suffered terrible losses in the infamous surprise attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese on the 7th of December. A line had been crossed and now both countries were involved in a war on European soil. For that reason, a case could be made for the 11th of December 1941 being the date when the moon race, if not actually beginning, had its competitors being called towards the starting line. This was the date that America declared war on Germany, and in doing so it entered into a conflict that would ultimately end with it coming face to face with the Soviet Union. With a weakened military force, the Soviets found themselves losing territory, and by the end of 1941 the Nazis were at the gates of Moscow. At this point, Stalin's aim was the very survival of Russia, but as the war progressed, his aim turned from survival to conquest. As the tide turned against the Nazis, and the Red Army regained the land that had been lost during Hitler's fatal folly, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, Stalin set his mind to other priorities, and he began to make plans for a post-war Soviet sphere of influence. As the Soviet storm bore down on the countries bordering the USSR, Stalin calculated that with the German forces deteriorating on all sides, by land, sea and air, he could delay the war's end long enough to ensure that he controlled the Eastern European countries. To this end, the direct march to Berlin was halted, as the Soviet forces swept down and through Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Albania, Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia. Churchill had wanted to send British and American forces upwards through the Balkans to prevent this land grab, but America, and unsurprisingly, Russia wanted a concentrated invasion of Western Europe through France. In the last months of the Third Reich, Russia was a well-armed superpower with a battle-hardened military machine, devouring land in the east and developing the capability to overrun and control countries and influence the governing of that country by threat and by force. It was a sobering realization for the West to see that Stalin was now fighting not to bring freedom from oppression, but to become the new oppressor. Meanwhile, the Americans were closing in from the West, and they had also seen a massive mobilization of its military might, and were in sight of unleashing a new terrible power on the world in their own right. The post-war world would be dominated by these two superpowers, and the future ultimate arena of competition would be in space. The rockets that would begin the expansion of their rivalry beyond the atmosphere were already falling onto Allied territory in the form of Hitler's V-2 weapons. The architect of this reign of terror from the skies was Germany's poster boy for rocketry, Werner Magnus Maximilian Freiherr von Braun. Von Braun was obsessed with rockets, and in the 1930s his best chance to work on them came by joining the Nazi Party and working for Hitler. Even with the knowledge that Hitler purely wanted the A4 rocket as a means to annihilate London, von Braun made a personal plea to the dictator after Hitler cancelled the rocket's production. Von Braun was not a man who was being coerced into working for the Nazis. This was a man who was the driving force behind the A4 rocket, and he would call his work on Hitler's vengeance weapons his contribution as a good citizen to his country's war effort. Later on in the war, von Braun's rocket construction sites and his A4 rockets were constructed using forced labourers, thousands of whom died. Using death camp inmates to pursue his dream brings into question von Braun's moral compass, because it came on the back of such terrible suffering. With von Braun overseeing the programme, the A4 rocket was successfully launched against London for the first time on the 8th of September 1944. A weapon so insidious that it fell from the sky with no warning, it was capable of leaving a crater up to 10 feet deep, and had an explosive force that could be felt a couple of miles away. Von Braun justified his participation in the prolongation of Hitler's war by saying, "A war is a war, and when my country is at war, my duty is to help win that war." In reality, von Braun had worked on a terror weapon whose only target was built-up civilian areas, and as a consequence of this, he was responsible for the indiscriminate deaths of thousands of civilians, not to mention the thousands of slave labourers who died during its construction. For all of his genius, von Braun had aligned himself with pure evil. Luckily for von Braun, the space race, or at least the race for the knowledge and hardware for rocketry, began even before the Second World War in Europe came to an end. Both the Soviets and Americans raced to seek out Germany's rocket experts and smuggle them away to work on their own space programs. Von Braun, always thinking of the future, didn't wait to be found. He made sure that he was captured, and on the 2nd of May 1945, it was a very smug-looking von Braun who surrendered to the American forces. As von Braun escaped from the dying embers of Hitler's war, he was sent with other German scientists under the cover of Operation Paperclip to the US Army's Fort Bliss near to El Paso, Texas. With a new menace rising from the flames and destruction of continental Europe, the Nazi scientists would have their pasts set aside. Their knowledge was going to be invaluable to the Americans if they wanted to stay ahead of the Soviets, who were also secretly seeking out German scientists to put to work advancing their own cause.